Okay, let's move on here and get a little bit more specific with what we're talking about. So we'll dive into prospect theory. That'll be the main focus of this lecture video. And I will also cover a bit on the influence of time when we're still focusing on utility here. So with the focus still being on utility, what we see is that actually there's not a one-to-one relationship. For the actual value of propositions. And this is due to psychological functions. And so going back quite a long ways here, we get into the law of diminishing returns, also known as declining marginal utility. And so with this is covered by the graph here. We see that subjective value, or what we're talking about in terms of utility here, does not have a linear increase. And as numbers get larger and larger, here we're talking about wealth, but again, it doesn't necessarily need to be wealth. But as we get to larger and larger numbers here, we see that there is not that same increase, right? It's a less steep increase. It plateaus as these numbers get larger. And so, just as an example, let's say we can think about a difference between $0 and $100,000. So that would be in this area, right? That difference seems pretty large. But if we start talking about really massive numbers, like the difference between $1 billion and $1,100,000, that difference stops, psychologically speaking, seeming as large, excuse me, as large, even though in terms of just a monetary difference, that's the same amount as $0 to $100,000, right? So that is what I'm talking about here with this psychological curve. So a couple of examples here. Let's move me out of the way so you can see that. Let's say that you are playing a game of craps, again, as in the last lecture video. There are quite a few examples we can think about. We'll get into two here that are similar scenarios that can oftentimes, on average, have different results. But with this craps example, you're down $50. You have two options here, right? You can either quit, and obviously, then at that point, there's a 100% chance of losing that $50. Or you can gamble, and let's say, just for the sake of this scenario, that there would be a 25% chance of losing $200 or a 75% chance of losing $0, getting that $50 back. In other words, what do you think you would do? Well, it seems as though, on average, in this scenario, people prefer to take the risk and gamble and take the risk of losing that $200, but also have a chance to get back to no loss. However, let's think about a different scenario. Let's say that you bought a new truck. Um, and for this truck, you're considering whether or not you need insurance. And so if you do buy the insurance, you'll pay $500. However, if you don't buy the insurance, let's say again, for the sake of this example, there might be a 25% chance of an accident, in which case you would pay $2,000. Or there could be a 75% chance of there's no accident and you never have to spend this $500. What would you choose here? So we see in real life that oftentimes people choose to buy this insurance, right? And so there's different responses here then for these two different similar scenarios. Obviously, the difference is for the gambling scenario, it was $50 and 200 as opposed to 500 and 2000, but a similar idea, right? So why are the conclusions or the outcomes to these two scenarios, what people end up choosing to do, why is it on average different? And so that gets at this idea of different value functions here. And based on prospect theory, we'll see that not only is there a non-linear relationship, but that this relationship is different for gains and for losses. And so in the gambling scenario, right, that $50 is already lost. And versus with the truck scenario, you've gained something, you have this truck, and you don't want to lose that. Now you don't want to have to pay a bunch of money. based on that. And so that marginal utility that we talked about on the first slide, this is more associated with the gains aspect. But as you can see, there are different slopes here for gains and losses. And so there's a steeper curve for losses, which really just gets at we as humans hate losses, referring to loss aversion there. And so initially, although it's kind of cut off here, there would also be a plateau of losses, but initially that curve is a lot steeper, right? As opposed to the gains, although there's plateaus with both. So what this leads to is when we're talking about gains, right? We like a lot of little gains because that's going to get us this steepness versus with one big gain, for an example, right? That's going to start to plateau. However, with losses, the steepness here, we hate a bunch of little losses versus in this gambling scenario, right? We've already lost the $50. We're already down here. And so it's starting to plateau. And what we'd really like to do then is get that $50 back, get our subjective value or utility back to zero, as opposed to if we lose more money, again, that's starting to plateau. And that's not quite psychologically as substantial to us. When talking about losses. And so continuing on with this framing idea, there are a couple examples. We'll talk about one here for how we can reframe things to motivate certain behaviors. And so let's talk about recycling. For example, in Wyoming and previous places where I've lived as well, recycling is made into quite a hassle. You have to go out of your way to recycle, need a separate bin, pay an extra fee for recycling, all of that that makes it more work to recycle than to not. However, we can change the way certain incentives are framed to make people more motivated to recycle. So, for example, my advisor here, where he went to grad school in Indiana, they had a system where for each trash bag, they would have to put one of these stickers on it. And so those trash bags are worth $2. But recycling, on the other hand, is free. So you can see how just the way that this incentive is framed, it makes one want to recycle a lot more because then you'll save money, right? And it becomes the utility of that becomes a lot more psychologically apparent in that moment. Last thing I want to focus on here is temporal discounting. This plays certainly a large role when we're talking about work environments, certainly academic environments as well, with things like procrastinating and all that. And we see that time has a very large influence on utility curves. Let's say each of these curves is for one task. And these lines here are various deadlines. And so you can have this be a class assignment, this be taxes, this be, something else the deadline. And with these things, there's not really a reward for doing them early, right? Although if you choose to do whatever this is early, if this is your taxes, it might take away from time. It might take time away from something where in that moment, utility or subjective value seems higher because that deadline is sooner, for example, a class assignment. And however, although there's no reward for being early, right, there is a penalty for being late. And so as we get close to that deadline and close to that lateness penalty, whether that's taking away points or getting in trouble for turning taxes late, whatever it might be, that utility becomes quite a bit steeper as we get closer to that deadline. And procrastination, obviously, if the deadline is Sunday at midnight, you might think at 11 p.m. on that Sunday, oh shoot, I need to turn this in or I'm going to lose points versus the previous Wednesday, you might think, oh, I have other things to do right now. I don't need to do this yet. The subjective value of me turning this in right now feels lower than if I were closer to that deadline. And so with that, one strategy we can use to stay on a better pace for turning in assignments or whatever it might be is setting a lot of deadlines and changing that one big goal to smaller things so that we can feel this increase, right, in subjective utility value as we get closer to each of those deadlines. So if you're writing a term paper, you could say, by this date, I want to have my research done. By the next date, I want to have the introduction done. Um, then the conclusions at a different date, things like that. So setting various deadlines to keep yourself on track, keep yourself feeling the value of each aspect as opposed to putting things off towards the very end. That's also why, for an example, I and many other instructors have classes set up where assignments are due weekly so that it's not all being crammed into the end when that subjective utility value is felt, to keep those deadlines consistent, right? Keep people feeling the value on a week to week basis as opposed to everything being crammed in and everyone being extremely stressed the last couple of weeks. All right, that is the end of this video. We'll cover the final topic for this section, which is Vroom's model, in the next video.